Okay, do you guys follow the Babylon Bee? Yes. Okay, so the church version of The Onion. So this came out yesterday. Congregation prays graduating senior be protected from basic secular arguments they never bothered to prepare her for. I won't read you the whole article, but it hurts, guys. It stings, okay? It stings. But I thought for Jeremy's project here at Faith Ascent, this is so perfect because you guys are the counterfactual, right? You're prepared. You're being prepared for secular arguments, so that's great. So I just thought I'd show you that. It's really funny. You should look it up yourself. Okay. So, you know, my area that I work on is political and economic philosophy. So when Jeremy asked me to come and talk about apologetics, I was a little hesitant because I thought, you know, that's not, I don't do philosophy of religion. I'm not necessarily, although I have to say I was trained under a really, really wonderful philosopher of religion at St. Louis University, Eleanor Stump. So I did get some good stuff from that. But it wasn't necessarily my area. So I asked myself, you know, what would I want to say to these students? And so I asked myself, what is my apologetic, right? Now, at different times in our lives, we're going to be interested in different arguments for our faith. But this is the one that I'm interested in at the moment. And of course, it does overlap with my area of expertise in political philosophy. And so I'm calling it Jesus's moral revolution. To me, personally, this is one of the most compelling reasons to take Jesus seriously and to really to love him and to love what he's accomplished in the world. And so I thought, well, I'll talk to you about that. Now, my only weakness here is that I have to talk about history and I'm not a historian, okay? So I'm depending a lot on the work of others. I have several books that I'm appealing to, but one in particular is called Atheist Delusions by David Bentley Hart. David Bentley Hart is an Eastern Orthodox philosopher. And this is a very fun book. It's very funny and acerbic and also extremely informative. So it's really a good read. And I'm taking a lot of what, say it again? Who's the author? David Bentley Hart. And the Hart is H-A-R-T. David Bentley Hart. What's funny is I actually disagree with Hart on some other big areas. But here he's responding to the new atheism. And he's kind of taking another look at the history of the West. And so I'm drawing a lot from this book and some of the expertise that he gained on history. All right. And so I wrote out some things to say to you today, but we can stop and talk about any of them. If I'm using a term you don't know or don't understand, or I'm referring to something historically you don't know about, just let me know and we can expand. And then, of course, we can talk as much as we want about it at the end. Okay? Also, since you got, where did I put them? Since you guys are here at Lindenwood, is anyone else from Lindenwood presenting who's an actual Lindenwood professor? I don't think so, right?
Well, Dr. Bobo is a former Lindenwood professor.
Former. Was he here?
He was here just Monday, yeah.
It's so uncool that he did not text me and tell me he was in town. I did bring my cards just in case anyone wants to come to Lindenwood. Okay, I have to do my part, right? For my institution. But really, it's very cool, and I do a lot with the Hammond Institute for Free Enterprise, running the Liberty and Ethics Center. We have a lot of really awesome things that students can get involved in if that's your thing. Okay, so the Jesus Revolution. It hardly needs to be said aloud that the history of Christendom has sadly failed to live up to the beautiful vision of life with God proclaimed by Jesus of Nazareth. Not only their critics, but Christians themselves, I'm thinking here of Dante, everybody from Dante to Cal Thomas, have famously derided the cooperation of the church in political malfeasance of all kinds, the cruelty of its persecutions, and its support of godless social institutions such as slavery. We ought not to hesitate in fully admitting and repenting of these things in some misguided attempt to save our reputation. As Rachel Denhollander has said in recent days, Jesus doesn't need your protection, he needs your obedience. okay? So I'm not here to skirt around or be blasé about the sins of the church. That is not the point of this talk. However, it is odd that the opposite point, though far more historically stunning, does need to be said aloud. While sin grieves us, it ought not to surprise us. Human beings vie for power over one another and slaughter and enslave their enemies, and they always have. They always have. This is not a surprise. If anything, we should be surprised that anyone questions the ethical merits of such behavior. It's not immediately obvious why the strong shouldn't rule the weak, or maybe just exterminate them. Why? The exceptions to this view in the ancient pagan world that preceded the rise of Christianity were very few and far between. We remember the arguments of Socrates and Cicero. You guys know those names? Yes, good. With reverence, these were pagan men who seemed to grasp something of a universal notion of human justice. But their creeds, however lofty, made no palpable difference in the behavior of their compatriots. Despite their high philosophy, the Greeks could not stop killing one another. Despite Rome's admirable system of law, it was crushed under the weight of its own corrupt empire. My thesis today is that the most shocking shift in world history, the one thing that could truly be said to pivot the whole world away from one way of life to something wholly new, is what I'll call the Jesus Revolution. I call the morality of Jesus a revolution for a few reasons. First, Jesus presented a vision of life with God that was so blindingly different from the pagan world he inhabited that many of his ideas are not simply strange to that mindset, but practically unthinkable within it. Like the concepts aren't even there, right, to think through his morality. Swimming as we do in the cultural ocean of Christianity, or at the very least post-Christianity, it's extremely difficult for us to remember just how absurd the teachings of Jesus really must have sounded to the men around him. Secondly, while one can find hints or elements of a morality that sounds like Jesus's in a few other systems, such as Stoicism, that's Cicero, right? Stoicism, Sikhism, Pure Land Buddhism, Hare Krishna, and now I'm just talking about the emphasis on human kindness. In no other case besides Jesus's were such absurd ideas actually carried out in a way that not only spread like wildfire, but also changed both the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, and the real day-to-day practices of members of all classes. All right, so that's my claim, guys. That's my thesis. And in order to present that to you, I have to do three things. So first, I have to talk about what the morality of the ancient and pagan world was really like. Now, I can't get into every detail of that, right? So I sort of picked one thing to focus in on, but there's a lot I could have talked about. Two, how thoroughly that old morality was discredited by the deeds of Jesus and his church. Okay, so we have to look at Christendom. And then three, I have to show that the failures of historical Christendom do not undermine the claim that Jesus really ushered in a moral revolution. Okay, so first things first. What's the best way to give you a sense of the morality of the ancient pagan world of the Greeks and Romans? Once again, I can't cover every aspect of pagan life, so I picked something that I thought would really bring home the philosophical shift that occurs with the advent of Christianity. Here is a letter written in the 29th year of Caesar from husband to wife. Quote, Hilarion to Alice, heartiest greetings, and to my dear Burrus and Apollinarian. Know that we are still even now in Alexandria. Do not worry if when all the others return, I remain in Alexandria. I beg and beseech of you to take care of the little child, and as soon as we receive wages, I will send them to you. If, good luck to you, you bear offspring, if it is male, let it live. If it is female, expose it. Do you guys know what exposure was? Yeah.
So leave it out to die.
Right. So you just set it out in the wilderness and let it die passively. Right. Okay, so that's a quote from that letter. Here's a pronouncement from Plato. This is from Plato's Republic, Book 5, concerning the children that don't fit into his eugenics scheme. Has anybody read Plato's Republic? Few of you, yeah. So you know in Book 5, he's got an idea for how to control the population. And he says, this principle has already been laid down that the best of either sex should be united with the best as often, and the inferior with the inferior as seldom as possible. And that they should rear the offspring of the one sort of union, but not of the other, if the flock is to be maintained in first-rate condition. Now these goings-on must be a secret, which the rulers only know, or there will be a further danger of our herd, as the guardians may be termed, breaking out into rebellion. Yes, the proper officers will take the offspring of the good parents to the pen or fold, and there they will deposit them with certain nurses who dwell in a separate quarter. But the offspring of the inferior, or of the better when they have chance to be deformed, will be put away in some mysterious unknown place, as they should be. A Greek poem claims that, quote, everybody raises a son even if he is poor, but exposes a daughter even if he is rich. Whew. It's hard to hear, isn't it? A Greek historian, Polybius, records that the Greek civilization was overcome by the Roman because the population dropped precipitously after men became so lazy and self-important that they either wouldn't marry at all or would only raise one or two of the many offspring in order to keep all the wealth together. In Sparta, the government checked newborns for health and strength, and then commanded they be either reared or exposed depending on their fitness and usefulness to the state. A second-century Roman doctor created a long list of signs of whether a child is, quote, suited by nature for rearing or not. I could go on and on, guys. There's no shortage of evidence that ancient Greeks and Romans exposed infants that were either deformed or weak, unwanted because female, unwanted because of their inconvenient parentage, or just because of cost. In truth, the practice is so widespread in all pagan societies that historians make particular note of the fact that two groups, the Etruscans and the Hebrews, actually reared all the babies that were born to them. That was worth noting because everybody else used exposure to thin the herd. Church fathers such as Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria express moral dismay at the practice of exposing newborns. The latter decrying the common practice of wealthy Roman women of preferring fancy pets over their own offspring. He says they're preferring irrational to rational creatures. It's tempting to condemn such practices and jump straight to comparisons with the practices of our own time, right? That's probably what's coming right to mind. But we would really miss out on the revolution that occurred if we did that. Clement's point is well taken, though it sounds strangely philosophical. She prefers the irrational over the rational. The reason that it is morally wrong to prefer an irrational creature, a pet, to a rational one, a human, is because Christians began to spread the Jewish idea that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. They understood this claim according to the philosophical categories that they were trained in, which is why they're using the terms rational and irrational. Human beings, whether potentially or actually, possess the ability to reason, to make a judgment, and are thus moral beings, just like God, right? So for instance, you can make a distinction between moral evil and natural evil, right? A natural evil is when something is lacking because of illness or something like that. A moral evil relied on someone making a choice. That's what it is to be a moral being. It's to be a being who makes choices. And God makes choices and uses his reason. This is why people are not pets, but animals are. Animals are conditioned to love us or hate us, but human beings, although they do respond to conditioning also, are capable of rethinking their own conditioning and going a different way. They have, the medievals called this liberum arbitrium. Okay, so we translate that as free will, but it actually means freedom of judgment, right? Think arbitration, arbitrium, right? Freedom of judgment, and liber is freedom. So in other words, I can stop and reflect, right? Even if I was raised one way, for instance, I can stop and reflect on that in light of something new that I've learned, and I can change my mind. That's a powerful thing. Chimpanzees can count to 2, 1 too many. Apparently, that's what the scientists tell us. But they can't do that, right? They can't stop and reflect and change their minds on an abstract concept. And this reminds me, I often tell my students about this satirical book I came across. It was a satirical book of daily affirmations. Now, you guys won't, do you guys remember the daily affirmations movement? That was like before your time, right? So there was an old Saturday Night Live skit called Stuart Smalley. And he would say, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me, right? And it was a joke about you look in the mirror and affirm yourself. But I found a book of satirical ones, right? Obviously, I like satire. And one of them said, "Today I will nourish my relationship with my pets since they cannot leave me." and you know, it's funny because it's pathetic, right? That's why it's funny. But God created beings who were, like him, able to reason and choose, even though this made them capable of leaving him. That is why we are not just his pets. But this is also the reason that it is always wrong to kill innocent human beings at any age. Beings created in the image and likeness of God, playing a part in the determination of their own eternal destiny, capable of a personal relationship with the eternal creator of the universe. Think about that. What a claim to make about us. These beings have an inherent, undeniable, inviolable dignity and value. And that's what Clement was referring to, right? That's why it was so shocking. Because if you're a utilitarian and a child is inconvenient, then it's not shocking to just get rid of it, right? But if the child belongs to a species with this kind of inherent value and dignity, it's shocking. So that's a shift. Their value does not depend on their usefulness to the state, their contribution or cost to the family, their capacity for economic production, or any other factor. It depends on the kind of thing that they are, a human being. This goes far, I think, also to explain the behavior of Jesus. He seems hell-bent on denying the worldly assumption, even among Jewish leaders, that wealth and health were the signs of God's blessings. In other words, something utilitarian, right? Something that the world has to offer. Rather, every person is invited into the kingdom of God. The deformed, the meek, the persecuted, I'm thinking of particular people he either mentioned or met, right? The justice-obsessed, the morally compromised, and the distraught, suffering people, they're all invited. Why? Because they are human beings. Human beings are not just inherently valuable because of what they were created to be, but also because of what they are created for. Those who ally themselves with Jesus will become like him. Even the Bible says to be called sons of God. They will participate in the life of God himself. It's a destiny so lofty, you have to be careful how you describe it so you don't cross over into blasphemy. It's that close, right? Entering into the very life of God, not being God, but entering into his very life. You have to walk that knife's edge when you describe what happens to a person when they enter into Jesus. Because that's how lofty it is. Okay, so are we getting a sense of the philosophical shift that I'm trying to... Okay, good. So let's pretend for a moment that you're an ancient pagan. Such a declaration of the eternal worth and status of every human person should strike you as utterly absurd. First of all, love for human beings is far, far below the status of the God of the philosophers. The God of the philosophers is a detached mind, incapable of being affected at all. Aristotle called this being thought thinking itself. It's just a mind, okay? And because it can't be affected in any way, it can't be concerned with you. It would be below God, do you understand? To be concerned with you. The phrase, God is love, would have been utterly meaningless to Aristotle. And I like Aristotle. I mean, I like a lot of the things Aristotle has to say, but he cannot fathom the Hebrew and Christian claim that's being made here. I really could say more about that as well. Secondly, it looks obviously impracticable. Who is going to rear all of these poor, deformed, unwanted children? I mean, think about the amount of energy it takes to rear a child who's seriously handicapped, right, or disabled in some way. Sometimes it can require a great amount of energy and resources to do that. And even if such resources existed, what could possibly motivate us to expend them in this way? Right? Even if we had the resources to do that, why would we do that? There's a lot of things we could do with resources, right? It's economics. Everything's a trade-off. Why would we choose that? It doesn't look very efficient. A society based on the values of Jesus, it appears, would never get off the ground at all. And even if it did, it would be bound to fail. I'm speaking from the perspective of a pagan philosopher. The humility and charity of the Christian is not just new, it's unthinkable, it's absurd. Okay, so I'll give you an example. In my classes, we go over Aristotelian ethics. I think Aristotle has a lot of good things to say about ethics, but he has many virtues that he discusses. Humility is not a virtue to Aristotle, it's a vice, right? Now, of course, false humility we might call a vice too. But you give credit where credit's due. And if I have something wonderful about myself, then I give myself credit, right? Why? Because that's the reality that he's living in. We don't give ourselves credit because we think that every good thing comes from God. Thus, humility makes sense. Humility is a virtue because it fits into the reality we live in, which is a reality in which all good things come from God. But Aristotle doesn't live in that reality, so he can't imagine that. And when Aristotle talks about liberality, generosity, what we would call generosity, he's talking as an aristocrat. Liberality is leaving a statue of Athena in your will to go to the city's library, right? Liberality is having your friends over for weeks at a time for a long party. That's what he means. It's the liberality of F. Scott Fitzgerald's, right? Rich people giving their friends, sharing their stuff with their other rich friends. This is largely what Aristotle's talking about. In Greek Athenian society, the closest thing you'd have to charity, maybe, if you want to even call it this, would be things you did for veterans, for veteran soldiers. You might provide meals or medical care for veteran soldiers. That was it. Right? Care depended on your kinship ties. It didn't go beyond that. Why would you care about a stranger? It doesn't even make sense. And then even Aristotle, who puts a lot of emphasis on human reason and being a member of that species, of a rational species, even he says, yeah, but the barbarians are like subrational. That's obvious, right? It doesn't even occur to him that they're fully participating in humanity. And I won't get into what he says about women. It's bad. So not only is it unthinkable, and that's what I'm trying to get with you guys here, and I talk to my students a lot about this too, is we have to kind of wrap our minds around being from a culture that's not ours, right? We have to try and imagine what it would really be like for it to be unthinkable to expend resources and energy on strangers, okay? And not only is it unthinkable, but it's dangerous. The pagan emperors were right to feel threatened by these Christian upstarts, even when their ranks were few. And I'll give you some quotes here. The hostile Emperor Julian lamented that, quote, "It is the Christians' philanthropy towards strangers, the care they take of the graves of the dead, and the affected sanctity with which they conduct their lives that have done most to spread their atheism." Do you know why the Christians were called atheists? Did anyone know that about the early church? Yeah.
Because they don't accept the full pantheon?
Right. So Christians reject the city's gods, they reject the Roman pantheon, so they were called atheists, even though clearly they were not technically atheists. And remember, the emperor's got, this is important to remember, on Augustus Caesar's coin, right, with his face on it. What did it say under his face? Son of God. The emperor entered into the pantheon, right? He became divine. So you would be threatened, wouldn't you? That's a revolutionary thing. Again, he complains to one of his pagan priests, quote, "It is a disgrace that these impious Galileans care not only for their own poor, but for ours as well." Galileans as in Galilee, right? They embarrassed him. In fact, Christians rescued babies exposed by pagan parents all the time. And that was probably not too popular. And picked up sick pagans out of the road where they had been thrown by their families in order to care for them. People knew that they could catch something by being around a sick person. So when someone became ill, they just threw them out into the road, even their own family members. And even though pagans were persecuting Christians, Christians would care for them. During the medieval period, the Hospitaller movement began, Hospitaller, in which rich landowning Christians would donate huge tracts of land and large portions of their personal fortune to open hospitals until every major city had one. The Knights of St. John were given the decree of Dupuy called, now just Listen to this title from the viewpoint of a pagan person. Just for a moment, imagine hearing this title and trying to understand it. Quote, How Our Lords the Sick Should Be Received and Served. Right? Why are they our lords? That makes no sense from the pagan perspective. The whole church, and particularly the monasteries, were referred to as the patrimony of the poor, the inheritance of the poor. A 19th century historian generally hostile to the church, W.E.H. Lackey, claims that it is, quote, commitment to the poor, both in spirit and in sheer scope, constituted something new in the Western world and represented a dramatic improvement over the standards of classical antiquity. He says this through gritted teeth, right? He doesn't necessarily want to give the church a whole lot of credit, but he has to admit there was nothing like this in the classical world. People didn't open hospitals for strangers. That's not something you spend your time and money doing. Okay? And since I love to keep you guys awake, I always love to keep students awake, and the way to do that is to be controversial, so I'll be a little controversial. I'm going to assume most of us are Protestants in this room. Are there some, so if we think of the church as Protestants, Catholics, and Eastern Orthodox, most of us are Protestants, I guess, okay? Well, we have a few things to answer for, my friends, because I'm afraid that we have allowed ourselves to get roped in to what I'm going to call the Enlightenment self-congratulation. Okay? So the Enlightenment, thanks for that. The Enlightenment thinkers really wanted to congratulate themselves about supposedly dragging humanity out of these dark ages and into the light, right? And in so doing, they loved to criticize the Catholic Church. Well, I think sometimes in our zeal to differentiate ourselves from Catholics, we have given up a wonderful resource, which is the medieval history of the church, right? We have underplayed it. And of course, we have to recall that the Protestant movement didn't start until the 1500s, right? So all Christians living before the 1500s are either Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. And of course, that split is 1050 or something when that occurs. Okay, so let's take a look at this. We've failed to acknowledge the moral revolution that was carried on by those monks who received anyone of any social class into their ranks. Do you know how weird that is? To have an organization that's classless? You could have a peasant studying right alongside a nobleman's son? That's bizarre in the history of the world. They preserved the learning of the centuries with their manuscripts. I'm sure we're familiar with that. If you, for a fun read, pick up How the Irish Saved Civilization. It's all about the Irish monks copying the manuscripts. They made the care of the poor and the sick their daily business. In their humility, they worked in the fields themselves, all the way up to the abbot of the monastery. There's stories of the Pope trying to visit an abbot who was, the father, right, the head of the monastery. He tried to visit the abbot and he couldn't find him. And he's looking all over. He's saying, I'm the Pope, I'm here. And they say, oh, well, he's out in the fields working along with the other monks. Just as a sidebar, Aristotle couldn't understand how you could bring together the contemplative life with the active life. He said they must just be two separate lives, right? There are people who soldier and work and trade, and then there are philosophers who contemplate. But look at the monasteries. They brought together those two lives, the active and the contemplative. As Mother Teresa pointed out, if you want to meditate on loving Jesus, clean the boils off of the back of a leper. And you'll have contemplation, right? You'll see clearly. They used the benefits of leisure and learning with which they were blessed to cultivate the wilderness, advance science, both practical and theoretical, and advance civil and international law. They invented new forms of irrigation, water power systems, and techniques for improving cattle breeds. Every serious medieval historian today will affirm what I've just said. But what a sad commentary on our historical ignorance that we continue to buy popular histories that play into these Dark Ages stereotypes. So I can't possibly cover all of this in a short amount of time, but suffice it to say that the notion of the human person as an individual and not just as a part of something else is a Jewish and Christian idea. The term person, personhood, is a Jewish and Christian idea. The notion that there are two kingdoms, one attentive to earthly peace and another to spiritual well-being, and thus that the emperor is not God, and that he must answer to God, is a Jewish and Christian idea. Separation of church and state? It's a Jewish and Christian idea, right? What did the prophets do? They went and yelled at the kings, right? For disobeying God. Now imagine that. You can't say that to an Eastern emperor. He is God. The notion that we are not only responsible for ourselves, but also for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger are Jewish and Christian ideas. They don't exist in the pagan world because the underlying metaphysics, the underlying understanding of reality as created by a reasonable and deeply loving being didn't exist for them. Okay, so the underlying philosophy, or theology we might say, is what gives rise to the changed behavior. And that's why all the ideas I just mentioned above would have sounded so absurd and revolutionary in the most derogatory sense of the term to pagans, right? We think of, oh, revolution. We always think that's a good, we're American Revolution, right? So we think of revolution as a good term. Well, not necessarily, right? It can be incredibly dangerous to be revolutionary. It can be hugely threatening to social order to be revolutionary. So that can be a very derogatory term as well. And to the pagans, the Christians were dangerous. These ideas of human dignity, natural law, and the preference for the poor reflect a reality that the pagans denied. Okay, nowadays, soaked in the achievements of the Christian West, it has become vogue to turn around and, utilizing those values, critique the very civilization from whence they sprung. And why not? We ought to answer for our failures. I can't address all of them here, but many obvious ones spring to mind. Slavery, religious wars, witch hunts, the relationship with science, right? I mean, these are ones that you often hear about. It's important to keep in mind while addressing these that the narrative we've often received about them comes from a particular kind of Enlightenment account of history, that the Middle Ages were a loss of the wonderful, tolerant paganism of the classical period. And only after the religious superstitions were sloughed off could we emerge into the light of reason. This is kind of the story that was told in the latter period of the Enlightenment. No one really buys this story anymore, not even secular historians that are hostile to the faith, because there was such, the advancements of the Middle Ages were so important as a foundation for what went on in the Enlightenment, but you hear it in popular discussions. Instead, it's now universally acknowledged among those who actually study the period that the High Middle Ages, so that's, depending on how you want to play it, the Carolingian Empire is 800 AD, so right around there, up to the time of even beyond the Renaissance, into the modern period, was an incredibly fruitful period in philosophy, the sciences, architecture, banking was invented at this time, international law, many other areas. Without which the great accomplishments of the Enlightenment period would never have been possible. You know, it's interesting, slavery actually disappeared in the West for 1,000 years. You ever think about that? It did. It disappeared for 1,000 years. There was serfdom, but serfs had major rights. They were tied to the land, but they had rights to the produce of the land and limited taxation. Yeah?
That was in the West, correct?
In the West, right, in the West. Absolutely not everywhere else.
Right.
Yeah. Gregory of Nyssa wrote in 379 AD that slavery is condemnable as an institution because at what price can one purchase the image of God? That was his Lenten sermon in 379. Now his stands out. I mean, he was very, worded things much more strongly than many others did. Maybe we wish more talked like him. But you can see the connection there between the philosophical commitments and the behavior. And to bring it up to date, read some of the anti-federalists railing against the accommodation that our Constitution made for slavery. These men knew full well that they were compromising with evil. They talked about it explicitly. But this shouldn't just be assumed. I mean, in other words, we nowadays just assume that we know that this is evil and it's something that we feel terrible about compromising with. But there are very few condemnations of slavery found in pagan literature. Even Cicero. I mean, Cicero was a Stoic, and he's talking about the universal brotherhood of man and what we morally owe to one another, and he didn't condemn Roman slavery. We don't find that, but we do find that in the Church Fathers. How many of those, so jumping, and I could say so much more, there's just not time to get into everything, and maybe we can talk about the Q&A, but I'll kind of come back to this point in a minute when I talk about the modern period. But let's talk about science. How many of those who condemn the church for its treatment of Galileo, do we all know this episode? Galileo's heliocentrism over what was really Aristotle's geocentrism. They were getting it from Aristotle. The idea that the galaxy goes around the Earth. How many of them know that he and Pope Urban were having like a bromance and they turned into frenemies? Do you guys know about this? It's true. I mean, the two of them were really good friends, and then they got mad at each other, and the whole thing was political. Like, it was just this thing between him and Pope Urban. You can read about it. It's almost hilarious if it wasn't so sad. It's not really Galileo's scientific claims that got him in trouble. It was that he was sort of a jerk about the way that he proposed them. And we know that because Copernicus didn't get in trouble, right? He was very humble in the way he proposed his, and he was prior to Galileo, and he didn't get in any trouble for saying that the sun was in the center, right? And so learning the truth about these historical episodes is really helpful because we have to put it into context. The church was actually the source of scientific claims. Why? Because they ran the universities, right? I mean, this is the advent of the university. And who's working in the universities? Priests and monks. Okay, so a lot of these scientific discoveries are made by deeply, deeply religious people. Not that every priest and monk was actually religious, I understand that, but people who were committed to the church. And we see that later too. I mean, Newton, for instance, whoops, there goes my earring. Oh, okay, I'll get it. Newton, for instance, he was actually a heretic, believe it or not, but what was his problem? He didn't think Jesus was actually God or something like that. But he was obsessed with theology, obsessed. He wrote way more on theology than he wrote on physics. So these people were deeply engaged religiously. Okay, so this sort of faith science thing is really quite silly when you see it historically. Another case, I was thinking of the witch hunt issue. You guys won't remember this because you weren't even zygotes at the time, but back in the 90s, there was, you guys maybe in the back will remember this, there was a hysteria about satanic ritual abuse, where everybody was talking about all this terrible satanic ritual abuse that was occurring. And it was at this...
80s, early 90s?
Yeah, and all the way back to the 80s. And it was the repressed memory stuff was happening at that time, where psychologists were saying that you could totally forget something and then have it reappear. Anyway, it turns out that this was sort of a popular hysteria. A whole bunch of people were put in prison. They've now been released. They found out that basically counselors were getting caught up in the idea that this was occurring and then suggesting it to the children. And then the children would go, oh yeah, and they described these awful things. And then the lawyers were like, oh my God, and now a lot of these people have been released now because some of this was genuinely just hysterical. And the reason I bring this up is because that's actually a lot of what really happened with the witch hunts. It was a popular superstitious hysteria that you get. I mean, these things happen every now and then in history, where you kind of get like an urban legend going and people start freaking out and everybody's repeating it, right? And then and what's interesting, and we don't ever learn this when we hear about witches being burned and all of this kind of stuff in the hilarious Monty Python skit about, weighing them next to a piece of wood or whatever. That kind of stuff is that the church actually came in to rein it in because people were just randomly, in some sense, grabbing some woman that they thought was guilty of this and doing some very weird trial that didn't follow any of the rules of civil law, and then burning them. And the church had to swoop in and say, stop, you can't do that. Like, there are rules, okay? And then they also, reminded people that most magic is trickery, right? And that's actually coming from the established church. So that was more of a folk superstitious kind of movement. But we don't think of that. We assume that it was the church who wanted to go out and do all of this. So it's an interesting, it's just one of those things that kind of gets told in a deceptive way, I think, and repeated over and over again. And actually, ancient people were very superstitious. A lot of what the church was doing was actually preaching against magic and superstition and saying, no, we live in a reasonable universe. This is not real. And I'm not saying that there's never demonic things that are real, but a lot of the stuff that was going on was just literally silly. And I'll give you an example. Archaeologists have discovered, you know how there were like seers, and people who were claiming that the God was speaking through them, in the ancient world or something like that. Archaeologists actually found like trumpets that were hidden behind doors and like hidden up in jams and things like that so that they could make voices come out of the wall. You know what I mean? It was all trickery, right? And so the church was able to actually get rid of a lot of that superstition. People are just superstitious. I've noticed that now. We have a lot of superstition. It's popular again. It's crazy to me. I'm amazed. But it's true. What about religious wars? Once again, I'm just saying very quick things about a couple of these things that often get brought up. There's so much more you could say. But religious wars can be particularly confusing because it's often unclear whether people were fighting to change religions or they were changing religions so that they could fight over territory and title. And we actually have pretty good evidence that a lot of it was the latter. Oh, I don't want to be under this king. Oh, I'm Protestant now, right? Like all of a sudden I've been converted, okay? And now I have a reason, right, that I don't have to answer to you. And so sadly, that does explain quite a bit of it. But even if this were not the case, the actual amount of blood shed in religious wars cannot hold a candle to the sheer and total destruction brought on by the advent of the Enlightenment's favorite offspring, the modern nation state. I mean, we're talking about, every life is precious. I'm not trying to be blasé, okay? But these religious wars, you have thousands of people who were killed in them. Now, we're looking at 100 million civilians killed by their own governments in the 20th century alone. That's 4 times as many people as were killed in the world wars, which were the bloodiest wars that the earth had ever seen. The 20th century was ugly, my friends. It was ugly, okay? And frankly, even earlier, starting with the absolute monarchies in the 1600s, you're seeing the rise of the modern nation state. You can see it in the terror after the French Revolution. 300 nuns killed in one day. Behavior that you just do not see in other arenas. Even the Spanish Inquisition mostly just exiled people. We talk about it like it was the worst thing we ever did. Are you kidding? It wasn't even close. And once again, I'm not saying it was good, right? I'm just saying let's look at it relatively speaking. The thoroughly Christian civilization of the early church and the Middle Ages could never have given rise to the nationalist wars and ideological slaughter of the modern period for one very good reason. Power was distributed. The principle of subsidiarity. Have you guys ever heard of this word, subsidiarity? It just means that whatever can be done at the most local level ought to be done at the most local level. Right? Power is distributed in ways that make sense for what the power is over. Subsidiarity, which I can put up here. Subsidiarity. Very important concept. Abraham Kuyper writes about this, if you're interested in that kind of thing. Church and state vied for power, remember? So the emperor is not God, so you don't have church and state together. Now, they often get involved with one another, and Christian theologians consistently hate that. Right? You should read Dante on this. He's absolutely infuriated. All right. So sometimes they'll try and take over each other's areas, but each of them has their own legitimate claim, right? The earthly power can say, hey, I'm in charge of geographic boundaries and things like that, not you, right? And the heavenly, power can say, hey, we're in charge of people's souls, not you, okay? And so there's always this vying for power. Nobles versus kings, merchants and guilds, families and family members. These are called intermediate institutions. And it's practically the definition of the medieval world, is the plethora, the myriad of intermediary institutions. It's not just an individual and a government. There's a whole bunch of other stuff going on, right? You've got all of these private organizations and fraternal things and all kinds of stuff that are making claims on people's lives, not just the state. It was only the pure calculative reason of the modern Enlightenment that could usher in the notion of the centralized modern nation state. One unified entity making a monopoly claim on the legitimate use of coercion. This entity is swimming in blood. As I said, in the 20th century alone, over 100 million civilians were starved, frozen, gassed, and marched to their deaths by their own governments. So it's a little strange to hear someone say, what about religious wars? The church itself was swept out of the way as a passé tradition, standing in the way of human progress. The greatest martyrdom in the history of the church was the Eastern Orthodox in Russia under USSR, if we're talking about sheer numbers. Priests just absolutely sent to the gulag to freeze to death, hundreds of thousands at a time. I can't treat any of these troubling episodes with the subtlety they deserve in this short time. Suffice it to say that our grasp of Jesus' moral revolution is hindered by several things. One, a romanticization of the ancient pagan world that is just plainly inaccurate. Two, an ignorance of the early church fathers as well as the history of the Middle Ages. And three, an absolute refusal to own up to the devastating effects of the secularism in our own age. I think we talked about this last year, if anybody of you remember from the panel, but there really has been like journalistic malpractice when it comes to death by government in the 20th century. There's just a refusal to talk about that. It's very strange. They'll talk about the Holocaust, but they won't talk about Mao or Stalin or Pol Pot. We easily commit what's called the nirvana fallacy when we compare our own failures to some imagined time or place where people don't sin against each other, right? So we look back on the failures and we go, well, compared to the kingdom of heaven, this is a failure. Yeah, that's true, right? Because we're not there yet. Rather, placing the accomplishments of Christ and his church into real historical context, we can see that while we have often failed through orthodoxy, which is right belief, and even better orthopraxis, right practice, Christians have entirely changed the moral conversation and have been the source of present help in times of trouble for many, many people. I mean, who doesn't talk about human rights now? Everybody talks like that. Children's rights, women's rights, of course. Of course people are equal with equal dignity. Where'd they get that idea from? Not from Kant, don't believe that. We can talk about that. I want to leave you with one last thought. As I said before, there's something more to Jesus than simple human kindness or even radical declarations that all are precious and invited into the kingdom of God. It's not impossible to find similar platitudes elsewhere, though they're very rare. But there's something about Jesus himself that caused people to be willing to die in horrible, torturous ways rather than renounce him. Something about Jesus made it make sense to them to get sick and die from plague by taking care of the very enemies that persecuted them. Without the sacrifices of the martyrs, perhaps the ancient world would have nodded politely at this new cult and just moved on. It was the willingness of his followers to become poor, to lose their social status, to upend social expectations, and ultimately to die that caused this ragtag outfit to spread like wildfire through the Roman Empire. Jesus said that his people would do greater things than even he did. He said that. Something about Jesus attracted women and slaves and the outcast, and under what earthly circumstances can we imagine such a movement actually lasting at all, besides permeating an entire culture and now the whole world? As C.S. Lewis has said, some things are just so strange they must be true. Thanks, that's all I've got. Okay, and I'll just say the caveat, right? Number one, I'm making a lot of big claims here, so we could talk about a lot of things. And number two, I'm not a historian, so I'll do my best. Yes, in the back.
So, thank you for bringing it into perspective with all of this in the 20th century and the stuff with the religious wars. But if I were to say something like that to an atheist who was trying to condemn me for being a Christian, for being violent and evil and hateful, I doubt they would accept, yeah, but your people have killed more as an acceptable answer. So how would you justify the bad things that we have done without having to say, well, yeah, this was bad, but this was worse?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I mean, a really good one, because both sides can be guilty of making the same sort of an argument. So I can say, well, a lot of the times these religious wars weren't really sincerely religious in nature, right? They were political in nature, and it was really about territory. And then the atheist can go back and say, well, you know, these terrible murderous ideologies were really religions, you know, not political movements, which is what some of the new atheists do say. And so I don't think that's just an initial point, right, to acknowledge the importance of the question. It's really a fair question. But I think what we're trying to say is, look, let's start like this. First, we need to agree on human nature, what human beings are really like. And I don't know whether you can convince your atheist friends, but in general, looking at history, it looks like we're pretty awful. All right, now, I don't mean there isn't also this wonderful truth about our value and inherent dignity, but our behavior is bad. It's pretty consistently that way. So the question that I was raising is, what systems give rise to any departure from that, right? I mean, if every society, I'll give you an example. I went to the St. Louis Art Museum a couple of years ago, and there was a really cool display on Mesopotamia. No, was it Mesopotamia? Who had the ziggurats? Yeah, that's right. The ziggurats, right? And so with the steps, there's like 1,000 steps. And they had x-rayed this tomb of this queen. And in the tomb, 400 teenagers drank poison so that they could die with their queen and serve her, I guess, in the afterlife or something like that, right? That's just normal. That's just normal human behavior, right? So the question is, how did we ever escape from a mindset like that in the first place? That's what I would try to present. What sort of an idea of the human person would allow us to emerge from a mindset in which that's a perfectly logical thing to do, right? Or it's perfectly logical to, cruelly kill. Maybe you guys saw, I don't know if you guys follow this kind of thing on social media, but there was just a huge discovery, or a big paper written, I think the discovery is a little older, but there was a big paper written on an Aztec discovery about the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of skulls that they would put onto these poles to dress up their temples, and just the sheer killing that must have occurred in order to do this, right? So it's not so much, oh, you guys are worse than us, right? But rather, how did anybody ever do anything any different? And so if we look at a society in which, for instance, take the fact that in medieval societies, we really got to the point where only soldiers fought. I mean, that really happened. We got to this notion of gentlemanly warfare where you had knights fighting each other, and they didn't really involve peasants, And then, of course, now we've returned to total war where everybody's involved. But how did we ever even experience a time period in which we did that, right? And that's sort of the kind of provocative question I would want to help the person think about. Did you want to follow up on that at all?
No, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think your question is very deep. There's probably a lot we could say about it, but those are just off the top of my head. Yes. Yes.
It seems like that helps shift to a positive focus of what Christianity does well, rather than what the other ones do bad.
Yes, and also something happened in these are such big claims, they're probably a little dangerous to make, but something happened in the modern period that really is totally new also. And that was ideological warfare. Warfare wasn't ideological, particularly in the past. It was territorial, right? I mean, people just wanted your stuff. Aristotle called warfare, he said it's like hunting. You go take what you need, right? But the idea that I'm going to usher in a utopia through war, which is this modern idea, that is really stunningly dangerous. And I don't know, while I love the idea of, hey, let's just focus on what Christianity's ushered in, I don't know that we can avoid saying, okay, well, what happens if we decide to reject the notion of God altogether and usher in something like the kingdom of God, but we're just doing it ourselves, some kind of utopia? That seemed to be somehow worse than what you had before, which was just people not really caring about the dignity of other people's lives much and taking what they wanted. So it is it's not the same as the ancient attitude towards life. It's even worse in some sense, I would argue. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit about the shift and the fact that kind of academia corrected itself on the Dark Ages?
Yeah.
Going back to this idea of like late antiquity and stuff, because I think there's a general perception in a lot of evangelical circles that academia has this, 100% negative view of Christianity, when there have actually been moments like this where they corrected themselves. And if you take a medieval history class today, you're going to hear about how the medieval is actually a really good thing.
Yeah. So there was, obviously the Enlightenment guys, the way that they talked about themselves, it was very much, they called themselves the Enlightenment, right? The philosophers, the reasonable ones. Even at their own time, they were being critiqued secularly by the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers. So David Hume, Adam Smith, Francis Hutcheson, those guys were saying, wait a second, reason is more than just calculative deduction, right? I mean, you guys are really too narrow here. There's a lot more going on. So there were some critiques of Enlightenment thinking right away. And then Gibbon's Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, is that the name of his book? He really kind of, it's a way to sell books, right? You have a real simple narrative. Oh, there were classical antiquity, you had all this wonderful learning. Well, yeah, if that's all we pay attention to in classical antiquity, there's some wonderful things, right? But it was romanticization of that. Then, it was his story that really got picked up. He's writing the 1700s, and these dark ages, right? And then finally the light, peers through. And I think just the dedication to real empiricism, frankly, has forced academia to change its perspective, right? Because if you go back and really look at this, talk about logic, for instance. Just the discipline of logic is making leaps and bounds throughout the medieval period. Really complicated stuff I can't do. I'm not smart enough to do some of the logic that these guys were working on. Okay, and so just, the dedication to the historical and archaeological evidence has certainly caused a shift. But it's still the case. So two things are still the case. One is that current academia still does have this sort of filter. They never quite want to tell a fair story, I think. It all depends on what you emphasize sometimes, right? And then two, simple narratives are popular. Gosh darn it. It's like the bane of my existence, Because I'm someone in political philosophy who really tries to make people think, and look at the other side. And simple narratives are just so attractive. They're easy, they're quick. You don't have to do a lot of research. And so I think we are fighting uphill in some sense that it's just easy to go, oh yeah, there was this great thing and then a terrible dip where nothing happened. And I'm sorry, evangelicals, but we fed into it. We don't study church history. We act like Augustine happened and then nothing happened and then Martin Luther. What? That's crazy. That is crazy. And I personally felt so happy to come into contact with the thinkers of the medieval period. What beauty. And oh my gosh, St. Francis and Thomas Aquinas. These were people who loved Jesus deeply and ought to be taken very seriously, I think, from any Christian perspective. And don't even get me started. The Eastern Orthodox are great on the Church Fathers, really good, and we don't read them either, although there are Protestants who take them very seriously. But we really need to have a better grasp of our own history so that we don't feed into the simplicity of the narrative, I think is what I'd say. You're getting a lot of my opinion here, but yeah.
So this is a question that arose from reading the Brothers Karamazov.
Oh yeah.
And so, there's that famous chapter, the Grand Inquisitor,
Yeah.
where in the parable, I guess, the Inquisitor makes this point that oftentimes humans don't really want to have free will. They just want to be happy.
Yeah.
And I mean,
Yeah, he
It's-
just gives them bread. Yes, I know.
Bread and
That's a
No,
great
it's
piece.
really
Oh,
good.
you should all read it. Yeah. That's
is it now? Is free will good, or is free will inherently good?
Yes. Okay, so that's a complicated question. So the reason that free will is good is because it's part of our nature even before the fall, right? And so free will is not just the ability to choose between good and evil, it's just the ability to choose, right? You can make good choices that you can choose to do one good thing over another good thing, okay? And so it's part of our nature, and it's part of what it is to be made in the image and likeness of God, because God is free. Well, what do we mean by God is free? This is real philosophical stuff here, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. So God is not externally coerced in any way. Nothing outside of God makes him do anything, right? That's what we mean when we say God is free. He acts upon his character. So the reason God always does what is best is because he acts according to the kind of thing that he is. And what is it to be free except to do what I want to do? Right? So God can do what he wants to do, and he always wants to do what's best because that's who he is. Now, that's an account of God's character that I am endorsing, okay? Now, there have been Christians who have tried to take things in another direction, namely William of Ockham in the 14th century, and tried to say, no, it's more like this absurd existential freedom where he just chooses and we can't really explain it, explain why. And that does not, to me, correspond with the scriptures because, because the scriptures talk about God never changing and, his character is totally reliable. I mean, this is something the psalmist goes back to again and again, right? God does not change. And so in that sense, free will of itself is good. Now imagine a little baby who you put into the car seat because they're too little to do it themselves. Then they turn 2 or 3 and they just lay there. And you put them in the car seat and they just look at you and they just lay limp. Wouldn't you start to get worried? Right? You want them to go, no, me, mommy. I'll put on right? I want to do the seatbelt. Is that a bad thing? No, that's a good thing, right? That shows that they are beginning to actualize themselves, right? To realize all their potential. And so in that sense, I think free will is quite good. And it is our fallenness that makes us slavish, which is the point about the Grand Inquisitor, right? In our fallenness, I don't want to bother. If I've got to choose, I've got to think about it and I've got to reflect and then I've got to take responsibility for my choices, right? But if I'm slavish, then I can just do what you tell me to do and then I can blame you if it goes wrong, right? And so there's something very attractive about that kind of slavishness. I don't mean the institution of slavery, right? But a kind of psychological slavishness. And and so I think that that's lamentable aspect of human reality, but it's certainly there. People don't necessarily always want to be free, but in their true nature, properly actualized, they should be. Yes. Oh, sorry, was your hand up next to her? No. Who's next? Solomon, my own son. Yes, go ahead.
So when you're talking about no slaves being in the West, when you're talking about serfs being the lowest social class, social class there, being closest to being a slave, not being a slave, wasn't there a social class under the serfs?
I don't think so. Do you? I don't know enough about.
In social studies, we learned that there was sort of like a social class under them that weren't allowed to go out of their house, and would that be considered slavery?
It certainly would if it were true. I'm trying to think of who it is. Yeah, the serfs are just tied to their land, so they can't move and go farm somewhere else, although people rarely moved in those days anyway, right? You stayed in your village and your grandchildren and great-grandchildren did too. But they had a lot of rights and they had protection from the Lord. I don't know who this other class of people would be. I'd love to hear about it, so I can be corrected for sure. But I'm not sure who that would be. Also, it's worth noting, and I'll call on you guys in a second, it's worth noting that actually the Romans who became serfs were people who sold themselves into serfdom because they considered themselves to be tax slaves. So they were being taxed so heavily that they basically felt that all of their goods were being confiscated. So it would be better to at least have a right to 90% of the produce of my land, and have that right than to just be taxed into kingdom come, which is interesting. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, so as far as I know, the serfdom system does not have a class underneath it, but I don't know for sure. I was gonna ask him, do you know what country you were discussing?
Was it just Europe?
As far as I know, there might be an exception.
There weren't countries then either, but right? There was
Region, area,
princedoms.
state.
Yeah, just Europe.
What was your favorite topic? Like it was a certain time period.
We were talking about the Middle Ages. Yeah, I was talking about Europe.
Right,
So.
that's what I was thinking of.
And someone in the back?
The only other class lower than the serfs I can imagine would be criminals, because during
Sure.
that time, people were consolidating near castles, and the nobles who controlled the castles wanted someone to farm for them, so they would sell their land to the serfs in exchange for the serfs working the land, and the serfs would not only get land to work, but protection from the noble in return.
Yeah,
So someone who's outside that system
Sure, a
could
criminal.
technically be
Yeah.
placed below it, but I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't mean to jump into this controversy at all, but I'm just using it as an example of the philosophical ideas here. Let's take Thomas Aquinas as an example when he's talking about the natural law. And he says the law has to be for the common good. And he defines the common good as the good of each. So it's not the good of all, like we're all in some aggregate soup. It's the good of each, right? And so you wonder, how does he handle criminals? And he actually he requires that we justify our punishment of criminals not only because for the protection of society, but for the good of the criminal. Believe it or not, right? And so capital punishment, for instance, is appropriate in a situation where, and this is just Thomas Aquinas, I'm not personally taking this position, but I'm just showing capital punishment would be appropriate in a situation where that is the only way to stop that person from continuing to commit crimes. But the reason that the Catholic Church, in many ways, doesn't really support capital punishment now is because we're in a situation where we could stop them without killing them, right? I mean, and so in other words, it goes back to this notion of the good of each, even the criminal, right? That justice has to be good for every single member of the society. I mean, and they're willing to tie themselves in those kinds of knots in order to honor the way of Jesus. I mean, you could just go, forget it, just throw them in a pit, who cares? But they're not going to do that, right? They're going to force themselves to answer to the way of Jesus. And even if we don't particularly buy into that logic, we can see how faithful they're attempting to be, which I think is a perspective we don't often see. Do we have someone else? I think you had something, didn't you?
It was, I'll say it now, that when you were talking about the impact Jesus has had, I'm always amazed about the undertold story about how World War I almost ended before it began with the Christmas truce of 1914.
Oh, if you just want to cry your eyes out, you can read the story of the Christmas truce. What a wonderful, wonderful story. Yeah. The Germans and the British ceasefire on Christmas Day, and it was sort of like, hey, do we want to take a break? They're kind of yelling across the region. So they're like, why don't we take Christmas off? And they all agree. And then they sing hymns together. They give each other wine and cakes. I mean, it's like, are you kidding me? It's what a beautiful story. And don't we wish that the peace could have just continued? What a terrible war. I mean, and World War I is a great example of the ideological warfare of the 20th century. I mean, it's a war that it's the modern nation states entangled with one another, just snowballing. The whole situation just snowballs until the whole world is in this war. And it was totally useless. I mean, it wasn't fought for any great reason. It didn't accomplish much, and it was so deadly, and gosh, I mean, it was a total waste. At least with World War II, we can feel like, we're fighting the evil empire here, right? Or we're stopping somebody from doing something terrible. But in World War I, it wasn't even that. You didn't even have that to go on. So you wish it could have just ended.
I mean, it's worth having a discussion because, what motivated eliminated those people. Who has, like you said, who has the right to stand up and say to their king, no, I'm going to take the day off.
Right, it's Christmas, and we're all Christians here. We're going to take the day off. Okay, yes.
So I was wondering, nations tend to deteriorate, and that seemed to be a thing with the church as well, that as we got further from Christ, the Catholic Church tended to grow in some areas, but deteriorate in others without constructive feedback. Would there be an extent to which that we can point to parts of that and not others as being, because Christianity, if it doesn't go bad nearly as fast, but it can go bad as well.
So look, I mean, I'll just repeat what a whole bunch of other Christians have said, which is that they call it Constantinianism, after Constantine, right? Constantinianism. It's the foray of the church into the concerns of the world, right? And not into the concerns in the sense of caring about them, but particularly into the worldly concerns in terms of participating in coercion, right? Participating in political coercion. And I'm not by far the only person who thinks that this is often the source of the corruption. This is almost ubiquitously held. I mean, throughout the history of the church, people are constantly decrying the participation of the church in worldly politics. And the reason I mentioned Cal Thomas, by the way, Cal Thomas was one of the leaders of the moral majority back in the 80s, right? And then he came out with a book sort of lamenting the whole thing. And he said, we were totally wrong in our approach. We thought that we'd use them, but they used us. We got took, and why? Because we wanted to grab the levers of power in order to have some influence instead of trusting Jesus to work through each individual, right? In order to have that bottom to top kind of influence, not top down. I call that, in economic circles, we call that emergent order, right? You have a wonderful way of life or a set of rules, and just allowing individuals to live according to those rules, you have all of these beautiful things that bubble up. Beautiful, complex cultural practices that bubble up from that. But that's very different from that one mind, centralized, top-down kind of attitude that states naturally have, right? Of course that's their attitude. And so if we want to grab the levers of the state, that may always be a source of corruption. And we certainly see that in the history of the Catholic Church, and a lot of people are concerned we're seeing it in the history of the Protestant Church as well. And so, I mean, it's something to think deeply about, I think. Any other questions? Yes?
Dr. Ferguson, I have a question. In addition to the book that you referenced at the beginning of your talk, where
Yes.
you said you're pulling some data, some historical data, do you have some other book references relevant to this big topic?
Yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah, I know, but just maybe some that would be appropriate for this age group and a little beyond that you could write on the whiteboard for us.
Yes. So this one is called Atheist Delusions, but I also pulled from Atheist Delusions. I also pulled from How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization by Thomas Woods. Okay, so this is Woods, this is Hart. If you wanna, I mean, like I said, we've covered a lot of ground, so there's a lot I could say. If you want to look at, for instance, the claims about the 20th century that I discussed, the first person to really count the number of civilians who were being killed by their governments was a scholar named R.J. Rummel, and his book is Democide, which is a word that he created, killing of the people. So you can read that. And then those numbers have been updated in a book called The Black Book of Communism, which is interesting because this is one, these are written by two French guys. This is one where in the intro they admit that academia has been remiss in its handling, and they're pretty far on the left themselves, but feel like they've got to answer for this, right? They can't be dishonest about this. So that's like an edited book, so it's a couple of authors.